Welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name's Steve, and look, you don't have to agree with me on all of the players that I have here that I'm saying that you are drafting too darn high. The chances of me being correct are about as good as the chances are of me being a millionaire by the end of next year. Also, I ask that you do not count the number of players that are actually in this video. It could be 7 or it could be 13, but I'm not going to title the video 7 wide receivers that you're drafting too high or 13 wide receivers you're drafting too high. So I hope that you can understand that. I just went through, looked at some of the ones that stood out to me the most at this point in time based on their ADPs. Also, I am always open to changing my mind, so please, in the comments, let me know. Who do you disagree with? Who do you think the ADP is fine on? Or even you would draft them higher than that. You really like the player. And preferably with, some reasons outside of you just that's how you feel about them would be appreciated. But nonetheless, let's get on to the video. And as you can see here, also, these are, I don't have them in any kind of actual order. I mean, I'm going to go over them in some sort of order, but it's literally just a very random order. So I'm not counting down or anything like that. So the first person that you're seeing on the screen right over there is Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. His current average draft position is 44th, and I currently have him ranked 55th overall, so a little bit of a disparity there. He finished 40th last year, while he was, I would say, the team's number 1 wide receiver. I know they didn't technically have a number 1 last year, but I would say he's the most talented receiver in that group, and once again, finished 40th last year. He is now the team's number 2 receiver, with Matthew Golden coming in, being drafted highly in the first round. Well, being drafted in the first round. Couple of statistical numbers from last year. He had a high touchdown rate at 9.3%. Yes, that's good for last year's production. He had a low target share, 60th. Remember, now he's not going from being the number 1 wide receiver to being the number 2 wide receiver on the team. 55th in receptions among all qualifying wide receivers, of course these numbers are, and he had a low ADOT, 75th overall. That's quite low, being 75th overall, so that's not great for fantasy point production either. But on the flip side, he was extremely efficient. He is great after the catch, so that helps to make up for the low ADOT, and he catches almost every catchable ball. To say, low ADOT is a guaranteed bad thing for fantasy, I think would be inaccurate, because I love Rashee Rice. He has a low ADOT. I don't remember exactly where it is compared to 75th overall. And he's also absolutely fantastic after the catch. That helps to make up for things. So those are some of the counter arguments there. But I would bet on his efficiency going down versus going up. Or even if it stays relatively the same, maybe it's on even lower targets than last year. I would bet on his target share going down versus going up. So once again, I'm not even expecting those target numbers to go up at all. And I would bet on his touchdown rate going down versus up as well. So 40th last year, I'm expecting things to go down. If anything, that's the reason that I am hesitant to be drafting Jayden Reed as like a surefire wide receiver 3. That's going to bring us on to our next man here, Jameson Williams, and I got too low on him in my video. I looked at some of his numbers after the video when I went back and did a little bit of messing around with my re-rankings. And by the way, if you're not aware, I did publish rankings videos, so go check those out on the channel. And you can find all of my rankings up on the website, www.theffforge.com. Let me try that again, www.theffforge.com. Links should be in the description to the website, right to where the rankings are as well. So I was a little too negative on Jameson Williams. I could even go up a little bit more. Currently, he's going as the average drafted position, 26th wide receiver. I have him ranked 39th, however. And like I said, I can be convinced to go a little bit higher on that. But let's go over some of the reasons why I am concerned, at least at ADP 26. Basically, a number 2 wide receiver. He had the 13th most touchdowns among receivers last year, so he was a little bit touchdown reliant. Not as touchdown reliant as I thought, however, but they do also have a new offensive coordinator coming in. At the very least, we should expect some sort of growing pains to begin the season. Could things get better? Sure. Are things going to be different? Probably. Could things get worse? Very possibly, given how well we regard Ben Johnson, right? So that's just something to keep in mind for this offense in general, I suppose. And then we've got the fact that he's, I'd say, fourth on the targets list there. Maybe not. Maybe he's third-ish or second. Maybe he's right behind Amon-Ra. But you got Laporta and Gibbs as well on the team, guys who are going to soak up a fair amount of targets. This ball does get spread around a fair bit. So there is that, at the very least, I would say, game in and game out inconsistency question marks there. And then you add in the fact that they went up and they got Isaac Tesla in the late third round. A lot of people think that was too high for Tesla. It was higher than I had him, but I also liked him a lot, and he had a really, really good offseason. So, you know, if he has a really good offseason for football, he had a really good offseason leading up to the NFL draft. He has another, really good offseason continuing for the team. I do anticipate him to soak up some of the target share that was otherwise going to Jameson Williams last year. I just think that he is probably a little bit more reliable in those intermediate targets than he is, assuming he even wins that third wide receiver job. There is some competition on that roster for that. Also, Jameson Williams on the good side here. He is still young. He's coming off of a fantastic season. My no touchdown projections for him did have him ranked 31st among all the wide receivers that I projected, which is like over 100 of them. That's better than where I have him ranked at the very least. That's, in fact, closer to his current ADP. I would value him more in non-PPR leagues than in full PPR leagues. I have some concerns for him, but this isn't the strongest of all, like, you're way overdrafting him, but I do think he's being a little bit overdrafted at wide receiver 26. That's going to bring us on to Xavier Worthy. Now, a lot of people love Xavier Worthy. I get it. He's one of those kinds of exciting players. And if you try to call me a Worthy hater, you're just going to be factually incorrect. 100% wrong. I was higher on him during the NFL draft season last offseason than almost everyone was early on in the draft offseason, and even by the end of it again, too. When he was expected to go in the third round, I said that I thought he was a high to mid-round, second-round player. After he ran his 40 time, which if you're not aware was the fastest 40 time in combine history, I said that there was one team that I felt comfortable with taking him in the first round. Part of the reason is because that team drafted, every year they draft, right in like the final 2 or maybe sometimes 3 or 4 spots of the NFL draft. That's the Kansas City Chiefs. They were the one team that I was like, you go out and get Xavier Worthy in the first round. I get it. I'm fine with it. He's a first rounder for you guys. I'm a big fan of him, but as we saw last year, there are limitations to his game. His size can be an issue at times, and he is better going horizontally with the ball than he is, with the ball in his hands, I should say, than he is at going deep. And that was something that was the same in college. Could he improve on that from last year? Most definitely a possibility. In fact, I would kind of bet on it. I mean, he was impressive overall last year as a rookie. But I just don't know that 2025 is going to be his breakout season with some of the other players on this roster. He got a major boost last season, and he had to take on a few different roles in the offense, which, once again, he did a great job of doing that as a rookie. That's really impressive. That's why I do think he'll probably get better at those deep balls and give the quarterback a little bit better of a target, and maybe as he matures and ages, he'll get a little bit stronger at the point of attack to get the ball. But there are skill sets for beyond speed. We know this as a fact, beyond pure speed, that help to make players better at deep ball types of throws, and that's just not the best asset to his game. I would very highly bet that he's not going to get another 98 targets this year if the wide receivers are healthier than they were in 2024. And the wide receivers were pretty much both of them missed almost the entirety of the season. They're number 1 and number 2 wide receivers. So it's tough to expect them to not be healthier than that. He is a low ADOT, gadget-esque type of player, and I say that with all the respect and love of who he is. but he also does have big play upside, both in the catch and run game and as a pure threat, deep threat. He does have that upside. He was highly inefficient last year, once again, as a rookie, yes. I expect that his efficiency will be better this year. I just don't know. Better efficiency on fewer targets and everything. I just don't know how much this adds up to being wide receiver 21 on the season. Before the injury to Rashee Rice, the most targets that he received was 4. Those were the first couple of games of his career, okay? So, not the harshest kind of criticism there. But also, Marquise Brown was not on the field at that time. I don't believe there was a single game where Rashee Rice, Marquise Brown, actually there was not, where Rashee Rice, Marquise Brown, and Xavier Worthy all played on the field at the same time. Marquise Brown got injured early on in August last year, meaning that he didn't get a lot of time with Mahomes, and he certainly didn't get 14 weeks with Mahomes prior to his Week 16 return. However, when he did return, Marquise Brown had a target rate that was almost at 30%. Some years, no receivers have a target. I think like 2 years ago, I think like none of them had over a 30% target share, which is different than a target rate, to be clear. That's just an elite target rate number and target share number, both of them. Getting over 30% of the targets when you're on the field and getting over 30% of the entire team's targets are both absolutely fantastic numbers. And once again, he had very little time to get to build any kind of relationship rapport with Patrick Mahomes. I expect that Rice and Brown will be the primary targets in this offense, and that Kelce will probably still have a higher target share than Xavier Worthy. That could get very close, though that is quite possible. I understand if you think that having him ranked 46th is too low. I definitely understand that. Personally, I don't like inconsistent receivers, however, and I fully expect him to be just that. So although he might finish better as the 46th receiver, am I going to actually have him in my lineup the weeks where he goes off, or am I going to put him in my lineup the week after he went off, or I wait, he has 2 good weeks in a row, and then I put him in, and then he has a dud like he had the 3 weeks prior to his good weeks in a row. I don't like having those types of guys on my roster. So, he's just a guy who generally I am accepting that I'm probably not going to have on my roster this season. He's a wide receiver 3, and I think he's a very inconsistent one at that. That is going to bring us on to Deebo Samuel. Good old Deebo. Look, I like him. Look at him over there. He's just looking at me like, what the heck am I doing on this list, man? I'm Deebo Samuel. ADP 39, a little high for me. I have him ranked 51st overall. If you recall, Deebo Samuel was healthy last year. Actually, I think that looking back at the amount of games that he's played, now he does play through injury a lot, so that's something to keep in mind, and that does impact certain games of his, certain stretches of games of his very clearly. But I do think that his actual injury history gets a little bit overstated. He does play most of the games, most years, but even being healthy all of last season, he finished outside of the top 45 in fantasy receivers. And if you recall, even some of the other talent on that team got injured. He's in a new situation this year in Washington, for better or worse. We'll see. Obviously, people are thinking probably for better. He is 30 years old. His career, however, at 30 years old, it's not over yet. I get that, but he has been quite injured throughout a lot of it. One of my concerns is that there's a lot of competition in the short to intermediate range on this roster and over the middle of the field. That's between Zach Ertz, Austin Eckler, and, of course, Deebo Samuel. That I do think that, that competition could result in 5-6 targets a game instead of 7-8 targets a game. That does make a difference in fantasy football over the long haul, and even in individual games, 1 or 2 fewer opportunities. Those opportunities could have been 40 yards and a touchdown sometimes. So, especially with a guy like Deebo who can take it to the house. So, those are my concerns. I think that Deebo will bring more value to the Commanders than he will bring in to your fantasy football team if you drafted him. I would be more in on him in standard scoring versus full PPR scoring for some of the reasons that I just talked about as well. That's going to bring us on to his old teammate, Brandon Aiyuk, who I liked a lot last offseason. It's a different offseason. He's coming off of injury. He is going as wide receiver 49 right now, so it's not anything crazy, but I'm basically probably not drafting him. I have him ranked 58th. The man did, once again, he got injured. He tore his ACL and his MCL, both of those week 7 of last year, so not even like an early season injury. That's mid-October. The average time to return to play for an ACL and MCL injury in mid-October is 10 to 12 months, so that could be, a return time technically could be right at the start of the season. Odds are that he starts the season on IR and he misses the first 4 weeks minimum if he starts the season on IR. That would be my best guess at this point in time. Re-injury is always a concern for coming back from these types of things. It is automatically a little bit higher, especially the sooner that they come back from the injuries, the more risk that there is of re-injury. And if he's not able to partake in all of the off-season stuff and then he's going 100%, that's also another thing that can cause more injuries when these guys don't quite get their bodies all the way to being, season ready. And then you got the fact that return to their previous level of play statistically takes like 2 years for these types of injuries. Usually these guys are not themselves the very next time that they get onto the field. That takes a little bit while to work up to. Myself, having had a knee scope to my meniscus, I can attest to some of that, how sometimes things just take a while to get back to normal, if ever sometimes. So I'm going to let someone else take a risk on Brandon Aiyuk. Almost certainly, if we get close to the start of the season and it looks like he'll be available week 1, at that point, I will at least think and probably move him up my rankings a little bit, since currently I'm expecting him to miss some time. That's going to bring us on to Stefon Diggs. I will say, if he gets put on IR and you have an IR spot in your league, at least you do have that kind of flexibility. But now you are seeing my man Stefon Diggs, ADP 45. So another one, he's not getting drafted too crazily, but I actually have him one spot behind Brandon Aiyuk. I have him ranked 59th overall in my wide receiver rankings. His injury happened 2 weeks after Brandon Aiyuk, so that would be week 9 of the season, where he tore just his ACL. So those two things kind of just equal out to having the same kind of expected return time to Brandon Aiyuk. Instead of 10 to 12 months, it's 9 to 12 months for just a simple ACL injury. So on the long end, you're still looking at the same amount of time. But once again, is he going to start the season on IR so that way he can kind of, come into the season a little bit more healthy, a little bit more prepared to go, a little bit less risk of re-injury? I would think that there's a decent bet on that happening. He is also an aging receiver at this point in his career, and I don't like the role that is expected for him in New England. It seems like they're going to be, and given the people on their roster, I think this is the most fitting bet for who he's been in his career, which just makes him kind of an odd fit to have added to this offense. But hey, having a veteran, I get it all. Nonetheless, I think that his role is going to be old Stefon Diggs' role when he was in Buffalo, when he was in Minnesota once upon a time, right? As the deep threat kind of receiver, and especially coming back from an injury like this and his agingness, I just don't think that's who he is anymore. I think he's more of a Adam Thielen even at his prime. I really liked the role that he had last year in Houston, where he was primarily, very often, used in shorter routes as a sticks mover, as a possession type of wide receiver, and out of the slot even quite a bit of the time. I don't have the exact numbers on that. So I think that's where he's at in his career in terms of getting the most out of him. I don't love him coming back from injury, aging, returning to that deep threat role for fantasy football purposes, especially. Regular football, I get it fine. I just don't think they're getting the most out of him. But that's you can not get the most out of everybody and still have people in the best positions based on your, the people that you have on your roster. So that's perfectly fine. That's going to bring us on to the one that I'm probably the most least comfortable with. I don't know, Drake London here, as you can see over there. ADP, he's going top 10. He's 9th currently, average draft position. I think that's a little too high. I have him ranked 15th. I might be just a couple of spots too low on him. The sweet spot might be about 12 or 13. Oh, that's crazy to say to have him on this list, and it's just 3 or 4 spots lower. But when you're early in the draft, you got to make those right decisions, and having a guy who ends up as the 5th best wide receiver compared to the one who ends up as the 12th best wide receiver could be all the difference in the world to your roster. He finished last season 21st among wide receivers in half PPR scoring, so it's not like he's coming off of being the highest wide receiver. I actually had him tied as the 15th best wide receiver via my metrics, my consistency metrics, but he was 21st via average fantasy points per week between weeks 1 through 17. I don't care about week 18 stats because they're very odd and fluky and teams sit players and stuff, so I think that starts to turn things, make things a little bit inconsistent when you're looking at numbers, and a lot of fantasy seasons are over by then anyways. He had some good numbers here. He had the third most targets, third highest target rate, sixth highest target share, third most air yards, ninth among wide receivers for most touchdowns, seventh most receptions, fourth most yards, and very good efficiency numbers to boot. So that's all great stuff, and I don't really expect too much regression, but do we expect that to progress? Do we expect that to get even better? That's a little bit hard to project, I would say, personally, with all of those numbers, especially when you consider the fact that he still finished 21st with all those numbers. So, what is the actual ceiling in this offense? Tough to say. It's a new quarterback essentially coming in and everything. We really don't know how good he is going to be or not. And it's a young, evolving offense. It's not necessarily evolving, but it is a young offense that's probably not hit its stride yet. But with the young quarterback thing going on, I don't know if this is the year where it hits its stride anyways. So once again, going to top 10 just isn't quite a production that I feel comfortable betting on, given some players that I just like a little bit more than him, given players that I think get more targets than him, etc. I value those things. So we'll see where I end up on him by the end of the season. Like I said, could be 12th or something like that. Would make enough sense as well, because those numbers are very impressive. But that's going to bring us on to a rookie here, Emeka Egbuka, being drafted as wide receiver 51. But I have him all the way back as wide receiver 66. So let's take a look at some things that are happening with this offense, good and bad, for Emeka Egbuka. First of all, we got Baker Mayfield and this team as a whole, this offense, had an amazingly efficient season last year. Amazing. A level of efficiency that I would say has a 99.9% chance of not repeating itself. Not something I would bet on it repeating itself. In part because they lost their offensive coordinator. They have a new offensive coordinator coming in. Once again, at the very least, that usually means there's growing pains. And when you go from being the most efficient offense in the league to growing pains, it's very hard, once again, to bet on the same type of efficiency to happen again. Then you look at all of the targets that are great receivers on this offense. And I even left one out, really, the starting running back. I have the backup running back, Rachaad White, in here. But you know what? Bucky Irving was a plenty good wide receiver out of the backfield himself. Then you've got Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Jalen McMillan, who really impressed last season to my chagrin, and Cade Otton as well is a really good receiving tight end, and he's just hitting what could be the beginning of the prime of his career. There are a lot of targets and talent in this offense. It's very hard for me to see a simple path to consistent, difference-making fantasy output from Emeka Egbuka in order for him to reach that kind of fantasy success, in my opinion, where you're going to feel comfortable putting him out there. He's going to need a lot of targets because he is a very prototypical slot wide receiver, meaning more of a low ADOT kind of guy. And once again, a lot of targets, a lot of guys to get targets, so I see that immediately being tough to happen. I think that there needs to be some sort of injuries going on for him to pay off, even being drafted at wide receiver 51. I mean, just because there will be guys that would be drafted after him that I think have a better chance of paying off, essentially is what it comes down to. Nonetheless, his ADP is 51st among wide receivers. He is incredibly talented, and if Godwin does miss some time, then he's going to be able to stay on the field all the more early on in the season and have a chance to prove himself and build more of a rapport with Baker Mayfield, and ultimately avoid getting taken off of the field for Jalen McMillan. If he's going to, we don't really know what their plan is here yet, I don't think. and that will help to clarify where his ADP should be. I think it's kind of silly to take Chris Godwin out of being a slot receiver. I think he is so much more fantastic, and we've seen evidence of this in the past in a year where he wasn't their primary. They put him out on the perimeter more. I just think he's much more talented from the slot. But this kind of goes back to the Stefon Diggs thing, is if you want Emeka Egbuka and Chris Godwin on the field at the same time, well, outside of doing tight formations and stuff like that, just in general thinking of your typical 3 wide, 2 guys on the perimeter, 1 guy in your slot, it starts to be Chris Godwin's going to be better on the perimeter than it is to be putting Emeka Egbuka on the perimeter. But if you really want to get the best out of all your guys, maybe that means for now, Jalen McMillan's your wide receiver 3. He's better out on the perimeter than Emeka Egbuka, and you want to keep Chris Godwin in more often. So there's a lot of moving pieces potentially in this offense. It was an interesting draft pick, but I do love the player. I think they got a fantastic player, and in terms of long-term team building, I think that he should pay off just fine for them and pay off that spot. I just don't know about this year. And as I just talked about, too, for Chris Godwin, there's a little bit of that concern, too, that I have for him. Coming back from an injury, possibly playing out of position. Not that he's bad on the perimeter, it's just that he's better from the slot, especially for fantasy purposes. So, like I said, there are players that are going behind him that I would rather take a shot on than him. So you can check out my rankings to see who some of those players are, see who you agree with, disagree with. Let's recap who those players are in case I decide to make a short out of this. The top 7 or so wide receivers that you are drafting too high so far this offseason for fantasy football. Jayden Reed going too high. Jameson Williams going at least a little bit too high. Xavier Worthy, I feel comfortable saying he's going too high. Deebo Samuel, yeah, I don't feel comfortable with where he's going. Brandon Aiyuk, same thing. I'm probably passing on those guys in the draft. Stefon Diggs, same story there. Probably just going to pass on it. Drake London, maybe drafting a little bit too high. It's tough to imagine how much more of a ceiling that he actually has compared to all the great numbers that he had last season, where he finished as 21st amongst wide receivers. And Emeka Egbuka, a lot of things got to go right for him to pay off in fantasy football. And if you liked the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Bye-bye.